I'll get something out of the way here. I love Ghost in the Shell, but my knowledge is pretty much restricted to the 1995 original film, Ghost in the Shell Innocence, and the 2002 to 2005 series standalone complex. I haven't seen Arise or that Netflix one, or any of the newer movies, but I'll probably get round to them one day, though most of what I've heard about those entries hasn't been great, so I might hold off on them. No, but I think I'm fairly familiar with the original stuff, at least as far as the anime is concerned. The thing is, I haven't actually read any of the original manga, which was released in '89, which is why this game confused me a little, since it takes nearly all its visual cues and tone from the manga, and not the 1995 film. So while I'm sure some people might crucify me for only having watched the movies and the show, I'm going to try my best to sum up the collective vibe of the franchise as far as my own experience goes. If you're not familiar with the series, Ghost in the Shell is set in the distant, far-off future of 2029. At least the animated entries are. I don't know if the manga has a different year, but despite 2029 being a lot closer than it was in 1995, Ghost in the Shell is fairly restrictive in its portrayal of the future, where there's cyborgs and AI and shit, but cities still look like cities and not Blade Runner megacities. And fuck, some of its predictions have already come true in the past 30 plus years spanning its inception, from the changing shape of the internet and corporate power, to people wanting to fuck Short Circuit. Most of the episodes of the series and the films follow the Major, a cyborg with a fully prosthetic body and a member of Public Security Section 9, a counter-terrorism organization that operates in Japan. Usually each story will revolve around Section 9 dealing with some sort of terrorist presence, either from organizations or individual people, while exploring philosophy about transhumanism and AI, and dumping gallons of overly complex political jargon on you, with all the expository grace of a history textbook. And sometimes the Major gets her tits out and shoots them out, I don't know. I'll be the first to admit that I watched Ghost in the Shell when I was about 15, and it wasn't for the writing. But then I became a pretentious film student, and now I'm doomed to trap people in insufferable pub conversations about how deep everything is, and how you should totally care about how interesting my taste is because I know basic film theory. To be honest, the reason I ended up watching it was because I heard about Standalone Complex from my brother. I heard all about this crazy anime that was full of gore and tits, so being a horny edgy teen, I immediately sought it out. And while that sometimes happens, it probably makes up about 10% of the whole thing. Imagine the betrayal when my younger self geared up to watch this hardcore anime, and then I end up listening to Aramaki talking about foreign policy, and the Major quoting Ziga Vertov and Frederick Jameson. But luckily this is an arcade shooter, so we don't have to worry about that. The confusingly titled Ghost in the Shell, which made this video a fucking nightmare to research, is a third-person shooter released for the PlayStation 1 in 1997, and it was the first video game based on the Ghost in the Shell property, which, despite being a pretty good source material for a video game, there's only ever been about 4 Ghost in the Shell games at the time of writing, and one of those was a short-lived free-to-play multiplayer shooter, which is dead now, so I guess there's only really 3. But this was a high-profile game. To start, you've got Production IG working on the animation for the intro and cutscenes, who worked on the film and would go on to work on Standalone Complex, which explains why all these compressed cutscenes are absurdly well animated for a forgotten PS1 title. The game's intro is nearly 2 minutes long and is more or less just an extended showreel of Production IG dick-waving their animation tech girth, to the point where if you're interested in finding out more about how this intro was made, there's a 40-minute documentary released on fucking Laserdisc about the making of it. Sadly, it's not subtitled and I don't speak Japanese, but it's an interesting oddity nonetheless. I might even say arguably more interesting than the game it's promoting. On top of that, you got Masamune Shiro having direct involvement with the game's production, though how much I'm not sure. The animation director from Bebop was also involved with the cutscenes. The game made it onto the front cover of the first issue of the official US PlayStation magazine, and the launch party even featured some of the composers doing a live DJ set of music from the game, though sadly no footage of this event exists, but I did find this website detailing the event, which bizarrely still works, though again I can't read any of it. And going back to the music, the game has a full album composed by around 11 different techno and electronic artists. On the surface, Ghost in the Shell is an arcade shooter where you play the role of a nameless, voiceless, and faceless rookie stuffed into a Fujikoma tank. Each level has you shooting your way through various enemies to hit the end level boss, while racking up a score based on the amount of kills you got and the time you finished the level in. As far as the basic gameplay goes, there really isn't much to it. Mashing square will give you a machine gun attack, which is weak but stuns some enemies, and holding it down will charge up a rocket barrage. The longer you hold down the button, the more rockets you fire, but hold it for too long and you'll overcharge it and lose rockets. Targets are automatically locked, which works most of the time, but the game can occasionally get confused and snap your view to the nearest moving object. You stick to any surface you jump onto or walk on, and L2 and R2 give you a strafe, which, strangely enough, is faster than walking, once again proving that the fastest known form of locomotion is the cha-cha slide. You can toggle between a first and third person view, but the game will automatically put you into a first person mode whenever you enter a tight space, which is convenient but at times disorienting. You also have 2 pickups which you can find throughout levels, which are health and grenades. Health is pretty self-explanatory, and grenades act as some kind of last resort room clearer, and as the only weapon that doesn't have infinite ammo, but I mostly used it when I couldn't be fucked with fighting some of the tankier enemies, though annoyingly enemies respawn, so if you find yourself needing health before fighting the area boss, you'll have to run another gauntlet to find more health and grenades, and dying in a mission means you have to start the whole mission over again, as there's no checkpoints. But most of the missions are mercifully short, and despite some sections towards the end, you won't be pulling your hair out much. That's really all you need to know to play the game. It's the sort of bare-bones pick-up-and-play control scheme that you could see painted on the side of an arcade cabinet. For the most part, the game does a good job of emulating the types of movement that the Tachikoma and Fujikoma tanks are able to pull off on the page and on the screen, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't want to drive one of these things the first time I saw it in the show. They have this kind of frictionless glide to them where the wheels seem to be designed like a shopping cart, so whether you're moving forwards or backwards, the tank will rotate around kind of like a skater, which makes for some cool looking motion. While clunky in that PS1 era way, I feel the game pulls off a pretty close approximation to the freedom of movement that these tanks are meant to have, and there's an extended on-rails motorway section which sells the illusion even further. And for the most part, sticking to any walls you run, jump or strafe onto gives you a movement that, once you get over the awkwardness of it all, you start to master in a sort of half-elegant way, like a diver pulling a perfect 10 flip before cracking themselves on the side of the pool. But once the game starts restricting you to smaller interior levels, you do start to fight with the camera a bit, which can turn the game into a motion sickness merry-go-round. I was getting uncomfortable flashbacks to the Alien campaign and the AVP reboot. I'd say my only other major gripe with the movement is the lack of a controllable camera, but I can give it a break since that by 97 we still weren't fully committed to the idea of having controllable cameras, at least on the PS1. Either that or games were doing the Spyro shit of controlling the camera with L2 and R2, but with Ghost in the Shell you don't even get that since both L1, L2 and R1 and R2 control strafing. I also don't think this game was ever DualShock compatible on original hardware, judging by the manual, but I could be wrong. For the ease of video capture though, I'm playing it emulated, which seems to enable the use of an analog stick for movement, but obviously the right stick goes completely unused. If you really want to, you can play using a D-pad, but using that particular control scheme is like trying to ice skate in flip-flops. Over the course of around 12 missions or so, the game will occasionally shake things up a little bit by adding rail sections, boss fights, and a time trial bomb collection that takes no prisoners if you don't nail it perfectly. But the game's main sections can be broken down into two categories. Seek out and destroy X amount of things and proceed to the boss, or fight your way through a tight linear tunnel and then fight the boss. This wouldn't be so bad if the game changed up the mechanics of the enemies you fight, but as you near the end of the game, the enemies will get visibly larger and take a few more hits, but mechanically won't function any differently to the enemies you fought at the start. One pisses missiles and the other pecks you with a machine gun, and sometimes they look like Gundams and fly, but I couldn't point to one enemy in the entire game that felt challenging, or at least tactically different in the way that you fight it, and the solution is always the same. Skirt around it with the trigger buttons and fire wave after wave of missiles. Even the boss fights are the same. I don't think there's one boss in this game that can't be killed by just holding down strafe and spamming missiles, with the exception of one which can't really do anything if you just attack it from the ceiling. There isn't really any character behind the bosses either. They're all different looking as far as various shades of tank go, but there's no voice lines from the people piloting them, if there even are people piloting them. If this was like the show or the movies, I'd expect each one of the bosses to have a long-winded political debate with you in an unskippable 30-minute cutscene about why they're fucking about with terrorist stuff and that. Though Ghost in the Shell has never really been about having straight antagonists, just shades of grey. If anything, Section 9 is a shade of grey that deals with other shades of grey, in turn for furthering the agendas of politicians that let them carry on doing whatever they want. I mean fuck, there's a whole episode of Standalone Complex where the Japanese government realises that maybe it isn't a good idea to have a fully autonomous security agency that operates above the law and is better equipped than the military, and decides they should probably shut it down, which Section 9 responds to with, "I'd like to see you try." Actually, who is the villain of this game? The manual and the in-game cutscenes say that you're fighting the Human Liberation Front, which show up in the show, and I'm not sure about the manga, but I wouldn't blame you if you forgot about that. They're only mentioned once at the start and end of the game, and outside of that there's no interaction from the enemies you're fighting. Not even a call out from one of the guards or a Red Alert style radio call from any number of the various flavours of spider tank that you fight. In between missions you get more story from these admittedly well-made cutscenes, but strangely enough, for a Ghost in the Shell game, most of these cutscenes lack any substantial amount of story. I was expecting MGS-length cutscenes going into this, having experienced just how much of the films and the show love ramming every bit of exposition they can down your throat, but I think on average the cutscenes in this game only manage around a minute and a half each, if that, which is probably telling that a game's core gameplay loop isn't that interesting if I'm bitching about how there weren't enough cutscenes. It's a shame that the game lacks any longevity in its gameplay because presentation-wise this game is great. The environments, while barren, fit the Ghost in the Shell style. Locations are fittingly industrial looking, and there's even a level which takes a visual cue from the 1995 film, where you chase down a boss with thermal camouflage through about a foot of water, and the briefing that plays at the start of each mission also pretty faithfully recreates that 3D map thing that pops up every now and then. And most of the original voice actors are here as well, at least the dubbed ones, and they all do a predictably good job since they're just playing the same characters again.
18 people were severely severely injured when 50 grams of C6 were detonated. Some group calling itself the Human Liberation Front claims responsibility.
So they want to liberate us, huh?
Real terrorists.
This was not an amateur stunt.
Saito's company standing by on the south side. Do you see anything?
Nothing of any interest.
I'm sure it's a trap. I've just got a feeling.
I'll bet you check under the bed at night before you go to sleep.
But the real star of the show here is the music, which almost single-handedly sells the game for me. It complements the action perfectly, and while the scope of what you can do in the game is limited, sometimes the audio and the visuals match up just right and you end up hitting a kind of rhythm. When the music sounds like a boiler room set you'd hear in some underground club where everyone's clearly on ket and the bartender is doing keys in the back room, it just works when you then attach that music to the visuals of large spider tanks gliding around and firing missiles at things. It's a lot more electronic leaning than any of the music in the films or the series, but it's worth tracking down even if you're not interested in the game, just to hear some solid breakbeats and techno tracks. Sadly, I'd say I can't say the same for the sound design though. I understand the PS1 isn't exactly known for its audio fidelity anymore, but it's not the quality of the sound effects that's the problem, it's the scarcity of them. Besides the constant techno and the stock pew-pew sounds of the missiles and the machine gun, there isn't really much in the way of atmos or sound effects. I can't really turn off the music at all in this game, but if I did, I think the game would end up being eerily quiet. As far as the story goes, I'm not entirely sure what's going on, which isn't anything new for Ghost in the Shell, but in this case it's not because the story is particularly convoluted, but because these cutscenes, while good, kind of feel like scenes ripped from an episode of the show and bent around the gameplay to loosely relate to what you're doing. Like in Mission 4, the cutscene tells you you're hunting down an infamous arms dealer and even shows you an image of the guy, but the mission itself just involves you cruising around on a boat shooting at gundams before you blow up a nondescript ship. I guess that ship was meant to have the arms dealer on it? Well, we don't know, because straight after that we're doing a mission in the old city chasing after a cyborg that doesn't even get an introduction. Is this the arms dealer? Did he escape? Well, it's not him, because he turns up later in the game anyway. So, who the fuck were any of these people? Throughout the whole game you keep getting bits of story about what's cracking off, but the gameplay doesn't reflect that. It feels like playing an arcade game while someone watches Standalone Complex in the next room. Now is the part where I put up a spoiler warning and tell you to go play the game yourself if you really want to experience the game, at least slightly fresh. But to be honest, I'd say you can skip this one unless you're really into Ghost in the Shell and just want to see how they handled a video game adaptation. But for what little there is in the way of plot, skip to here if you don't want to have the ending of the game told to you. The last few levels of this game is sort of where everything just falls apart. For a start, you have to go through 4 whole missions of nothing but corridor crawling and mini-bosses before you end up in a rooftop section that... you ever have one of those ball puzzles as a kid? You end up flipping around and sticking to everything so much that by the time you realise which way is up, you've already fallen off the ceiling and plummeted to your death. And to top it all off, there's a very tiny platform you have to hit to try and make it to the last boss, which you will fuck up on multiple times. The final boss that you can beat by circle strafing again. It does have this cool set piece where you fight its second stage while falling from the top of the building though. But to top it all off, the last cutscene of the game does the whole Ghost in the Shell convoluted conspiracy thing and explains how it was all an elaborate plot. I went back through all the cutscenes cutscenes just to check that the story lined up, and it does, but it's hard not to be confused when the only information you're given is in short exposition bursts, and the level you play after that is only vaguely related to what anyone was talking about. Both the movies and the series have runtime on their sides to tell complex plots, but when the narrative for what sounds like a whole episode of standalone complex is boiled down to a handful of super short cutscenes, the result is just a confusing mess that feels like the game tries to put a novel into a short story. The leader of the Human Liberation Front is an arms dealer named Zebra, but in between chasing him down and shooting robots, it turns out that the Ministry of Energy has been fucking about and has a vested interest in Zebra. It turns out Zebra and the Human Liberation Front are based in an unfinished skyscraper that just happens to have its own nuclear reactor, and that a man named Sawamura, a man who we never see in the game I should add, is a representative of the Energy Ministry and has been contacting Zebra, and also has some kind of connection to the Megatech Body Corporation, whose building was blown up at the start of the game. Though what connection that is, we never know. Shooting happens and the reactor nearly explodes before you fight Zebra at the top of the tower, and in one final cutscene it's revealed that the whole thing was one elaborate plot where Sawamura, the bloke we never see, was collecting bribes from Megatech to keep a defect in the reactor hushed up so he could blow off the explosion as a terrorist attack, but Zebra went rogue and took over the reactor to try and extort Sawamura. The whole thing just feels messy and rushed, and both the main players of the opposition don't have any screen time besides this single picture of Zebra, which we see near the start of the game. At the end of the day, Ghost in the Shell is an okay game, but for the license that it's working with and all the effort that went into making everything look and feel like Ghost in the Shell, the end result is just an empty and hollow experience that's over in a second, like shagging me. Its gameplay is a basic arcadey loop that might have benefited from being housed in a ridiculous cabinet with some strange control scheme and a peripheral that would give Bad Dragon a run for their money, but when it's packaged up and shipped at a retail price, I can't help but wonder if I'd feel cheated if I'd dropped money on this thing back in the day. But I guess people did, and it warranted some decent reviews at launch. Even if you're massively into Ghost in the Shell and really want to see this, I'd probably recommend just watching a long play, because if you're not gripped by the gameplay at the start of the game, you're definitely not going to like the gameplay at the end of it. Hopefully next time it won't take me nearly a year to get around to making a video, but you never know. See you around.
As with sonar, the big problem with detection is interpolating the returning signals. All aircraft carry an electronic gizmo called IMF, Identification Random.
Chief, can we do something about the display in miles? I want it changed to kilometers.
Right, I'll tell you what, you fat little cunt.